I'm Fred McMurray, and I'm back with Ray Pillar and Jim Treleaven for another episode of Pillar's Principles. Hey, Ray. Hey, Jim. How are we doing today?
Good.
Fred, how are you?
I'm going crazy. Um, so the question of today is this, and it's one that I've been grappling with on the KPHRED radio station is how do you know when to up your prices? At what point in your fledgling business, because what I find is most people start out, well, they start out either overpriced and die or underpriced and get so much volume that they have to do something different, either bring in more volume or change pricing. So at what, how do you recommend people approach this process?
Well, I would start with the saying I've used for years, which is if you raise your price and nobody bitches, it's too low. And
Fair.
that does happen.
Yeah.
But the most important part of what your answer to your question is, you really have to be aware of what's going on in the marketplace. Um, in one of the courses I'm about to teach, that's one of the things they have to deal with is pricing versus the competition is a big one in the simulation for strategy. But so it's really a lot based on that. Then you have to decide your positioning, which could be if you have a premium product, you can have a premium price. If you're sort of average, you might actually pick a little bit lower as a way to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. But if you raise it and no one complains, it's too low.
That works. And that's very true. In our case, we do monitor our competition to see where we're at. Because we do personal interviews with everyone who wants to hire us, we get a pretty good indication of where we're at because most of those individuals have checked with other people. And then the question becomes, what differentiates you from your competition? And I like to say that we are probably on the higher side of in our pricing, but it's because basically we have a superior service. And we also have one of the things that people think they need to do is be rigid in their price increasing. So you need to cut a little slack once in a while. So if you contact someone and say, okay, you've been with us a couple of years now and we haven't raised your price. I'm sorry, but we need to do that. And they give you a reason why that shouldn't happen. That doesn't mean you have to do it.
Yeah.
But as long as you're on the positive side of profitability for that particular client, then you can leave it and then reapproach them maybe in 3 months or 6 months. Now, we have part of our program here is we know how much we make with every client. And because of that, we can pretty much look at how much we're making with each client, and our software will say, okay, here are all your clients, and this starting from where you're making the least amount of money, to the most amount of money, and then we will approach those clients where we're making the least amount of money and say we need to raise your rate. So in my case, our case, it is analytical, I guess is the word. I don't know.
As it should be.
Yeah. So we do, describe pretty much, what we're doing, and we're making sure that we're not overcharging, which is another thing that I probably should mention is overcharging.
Wait, before we go to the overcharge, I want to reel you back in because you both said a whole lot there. So one thing I want to drill into is something you said of there's two things. One, is when you talked about pricing, how long do you guarantee a price for? So a new customer comes in and you say, I'm going to give you, we'll say this monthly rate. How do you set a time period and say, this is you're going to be your rate for the first 12 months and then we renegotiate? Or is this how often do you, because you also hit that other part of when you look at rate increases, you look at the lowest, the client paying the least amount, and that's where you start to work on increasing the rates. So how long is it, how long between rate increases, or how
there is no specified time.
Right.
There is a specified amount that we wish to make from each client. So if a client is given a rate and it happens to be where we're making a decent amount, there could be some time, years, before we actually say, okay, it's time for your increase. Okay. Whereas if we have to cut the price on initial contact, we may be contacting them in 6 months and saying, hey, you either need to increase your rate or modify what we're doing for you.
So
Right.
you're not guaranteeing that rate for any specific time.
No. And we don't, that is also the reason we don't have contracts. That client of ours can say, oh, okay, I've been with you 2 months and my circumstances have changed and I need to quit. No problem.
Yeah.
So we're not going to hold them with a contract.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the short answer to your question, Fred, is it depends.
Yeah.
And at the one end is what Ray described, where it's, individual customers, no contract. I've seen lots of contracts, though, particularly in the technology industry, that specifically talk about price increases in the contract, limiting them to a certain amount, might be related to inflation or not, but to a certain percentage, generally every year. And so that's explicit in the contract. And, some companies don't actually do it. They're not required to do it, but it says they can. And then you said a couple of other interesting things, Ray, that I wanted to comment on. One is you talked about, it depends on inflation. Everybody's raising prices now, in part because their costs are higher, for sure.
Right.
But the market is just like that. I mean, it's really tough on pricing. It's crazy. You can go to the grocery store and fill your cart, and it used to cost $100. Now it costs $400. And then what you also mentioned, I think, is very important, is flexibility in dealing with individual clients. Being able to adjust, depending on the circumstance, like you said, if they've been a long-term client, that makes total sense. And then the last piece, which you also mentioned, was that you have to understand your costs. You can't cut your price below what it costs. So you talked about being analytical and tracking it. So I think that's really important.
And another thing we also have to look at is the cost of acquisition.
Yes.
How much does it cost to get that client? And
really good point. Yes.
And many people are, when they actually sit down and figure it out, are really surprised that it costs thousands of dollars to get a client. So why would you want to call them and say, okay, we have to raise you $5 or $10 and that's it? And then that client quits. Now they're in the hole for several $1,000s to get a new one.
Yep. Good point.
Okay. All right. So on the next episode, I want to drill into something that you both have kind of touched on is, okay, I have that client. Am I going to raise his rates or am I going to sell him more services? Because what I think you guys are touching on is what the total value of a client is.
Good point.
Over a period of time. And so on the next episode of Pillars Principles, I want to go through how you increase the value, because I've talked to other folks before, especially in the consulting space, that they get a client and they're at one rate and they never feel like they can increase their rates over periods of time.
Right.
If you feel that way, then the only way to deal with it is to increase the services they buy, at least
Yep.
in my. So I want to touch on how to increase the value of a client on the next pillar's principles.
And I have some good examples of that, so I will think about that.
All right. So, Ray, any last thoughts?
Yes, I wanted to mention one thing is that we are cognizant of the fact that we are, and I hate to say it this way, making too much money on a client. We look at, and we have lowered the rate.
We'll have to bleep that part out, Ray.
Yeah, and we have lowered a customer's price. And you may ask, well, how does that happen? Maybe during the initial contact, they said we want all this done, and we give them a price for that. But over a period of time, they say, well, drop this, drop that, don't do this, whatever. And we ended up looking at how much money we're making from that client, and we say, we give them a call and say, look, we need to revise your rate, and it's going to be lower.
And then after the ambulance gets there to take them up to the hospital because
They've rarely heard that.
Yeah.
Jim, last thoughts.
Well, I think it's a really important area for companies to think about, and it's a challenge because, as Ray mentioned, you need to be pretty analytical about it, actually, and definitely keep your ear to the market.
All right. I'm Fred McMurray. This is Pillars Principles with Ray Pillar and Jim Treleaven. We'll be back next week. Until then, have a profitable week, folks.